Good morning. And I'm going to take full credit for such a gorgeous day in Charlottesville. Thank you for being with us today. As you all know, this is the 4th annual James C. Lehrer Lecture. And it is an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you this morning. As you know, Jim served on the governing council for the board for many years. So my name is George Martin, and I have the impossible task of following in the footsteps of Steve Burns, Alice Handy, and Gene Fife, who served as chair of the governing council prior to me. We want to welcome Jim Lehrer's wife, Katie, and Amanda, and Lou Nash. Thank you for being with us today. Before we get started with today's conversation, I want to give you a little bit of background. So first of all, on a personal note, I have to tell you that my first meeting of the governing council, Jim Lehrer sat next to me. And wow, what a way to start. And I was so impressed. He was incredibly knowledgeable, and more importantly, he was wise. So we miss Jim, but we certainly appreciate his contributions to society in general, his commitment to the truth, if you will, which is big these days, and obviously his devotion to the Miller Center. So through his lens, we got to see a lot of things. And as you all know, he had the opportunity to preside over 12 presidential debates, every president from John F. Kennedy through Barack Obama. So this lectureship honors his memory and his contributions to the Miller Center. We're going to see a video in a little bit that will give you more information on the life and contributions of Jim. But I'm also grateful to Mary Ann and Stephen Burns, Fred Scott, Karen Turner, and Gene and Ann Fife, Peter Stroud, and the late Alice Handy for honoring Jim through this lectureship. And we'd like to thank, again, Jim's wife, Katie Lehrer, for her support as well. So on this special occasion, I'm also delighted to bring you some good news, and that is the fact that the Miller Center has received a new gift in the amount of $1 million in memory of Alice Handy from her husband, Peter. And Alice was just a tremendous leader of the governing council and devoted to the University of Virginia, but in particular, the Miller Center. So Peter, we thank you so much for that. And we thank you for your wonderful wife, who was just a tremendous friend and asset to the university. So finally, we want to acknowledge Judy Woodruff, who is a senior correspondent and former anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour, who was a featured speaker here for the first Lehrer lecture. And then David Brooks followed her, and then last year, Lisa Desjardins, forgive me. And we are thrilled for the partnership that we have with the NewsHour, and that is, and Judy made that a reality. So we're going to listen to a video now on Jim Lehrer, and following that, Bill Antholis will introduce today's speaker, Nick Schifrin. Thank you so much.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour tonight, the news of this Friday.
So being on television, particularly on live television as I was for as long as I was, it was every evening, it was a kind of up experience. And adrenaline. And
every night?
Every night, because the potential for making an ass of myself on national television confronted me every moment. Not only not to embarrass yourself, but also the pressure to get it right and to try to make sure that you've got all the bases covered, that you've treated somebody fairly.
And we'd only been in Washington a month, I think. We heard that in 3 days, PBS was going to get chopped. And then Watergate broke the morning you heard that, I think. After that,
It was over.
PBS was just forgotten. So when we saw Watergate, it was like, oh, heaven.
Saved by some thugs. But the irony, of course, the great irony was, we then later broadcast the Watergate hearings, and that saved PBS. Yeah. I got a call from George H.W. Bush right after he'd left the White House. And he said, Jim, I need a favor. Yes, sir. What is it? He said, well, we're going to have a little roundtable discussion in Colorado Springs about the Cold War. And I'd like for you to moderate it. And I said, oh, Mr. President, it's a deal. But I said, to my credit, I said, I'm going to take a dime for this. We agreed to do it, all set to go. Then I get a call from his office saying, could you come a day early for a dinner with President and Mrs. Bush? And I reluctantly say yes, thinking it's going to be another dinner and all that. We go downstairs, and standing there waiting for us are George and Barbara Bush. And there's a couple of Secret Service agents, and they put us in a car. And the four of us, just the four of us, have dinner at an Italian restaurant. The Secret Service cleaned out the restaurant so we could do it. And we talked for 2 hours. Everything was off the record. It was great fun. It was a magic experience, you know. And I realized what he had done. I wouldn't take money. So it was the best way.
That was your honorarium?
That was the honorarium. Yeah. Which was worth all. And
priceless.
Thoughtful man, though. Somebody owning a George H.W. Bush would think in those terms. There are very few nights that I left to go home to my adoring wife and not feeling good, at least about what we tried to do. Doesn't mean we always pulled it off. Sometimes we had the wrong people on the wrong story on the wrong night. But as a general rule, I always felt good about what we tried to do. Mm-hmm. And there were some times when I felt, till I was so happy.
For me to be here as part of Jim Lehrer's legacy, the person who meant, I think it's fair to say, more than anyone in my career, in my decision to go to the NewsHour in the first place, staying there over 10 years and then coming back, and I've been back 15 years. It's just an honor beyond the words that I have the capacity to say.
Moral ecology is a standard and a way of doing things. And so at the NewsHour, it was just that you're not going to be crass. Frankly, we're not going to be cable. We're not going to do horse race. We're not going to be unfair. We are going to be, we're going to be at one notch above TV.
I really am walking in the path of my journalism gods to me, and at the top of that mountain is Jim Lehrer. I grew up with the NewsHour. Some of the first images that I remember was of watching the show and watching him. And the standards for journalism that he set, I cannot tell you how important they are today.
Really great to see everyone. George, thank you for the great introduction. It is so great to see Kate and Amanda, welcome. Great to have you here with us and great to have all of you. And big thanks to the supporters of the Lehrer Lecture. This lecture started, I think, if I understand correctly, in a car coming back from DC after Jim's funeral, where Fred, Scott, and Karen Turner were with Alice Handy and Peter Stout. And the idea of doing this lecture came forward. Steve and Mary Burns, who was the vice chair at the time, Jean Fife and Ann Fife, joined in, and then the Lehrer family has continued to support it, and we're so appreciative. And particularly appreciative of Peter today. Peter's gift in honor of Alice takes us over our $40 million campaign goal, which is so fitting because Alice was chair when we announced that goal. So a special thanks to Peter and And really a joy to have Nick Schifrin with us today for today's lecture. My wife, Kristen, and I watch the NewsHour pretty much every night. And over the last 4 years, as coming out of the pandemic with then the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza in particular, Nick diving into these hotspots, covering them with skill, with precision, with empathy. We'll talk about that in a bit, but also the both personal courage that it's taken to do this, including as the father of 2 small children. So Nick, we think today is not a hotspot for you in the same sense. It'll be a little bit easier, but particularly in today's politics where, I'm reminded of a phrase about Washington that I learned when I was an undergrad here. It's not the heat of Washington, it's the hostility that'll kill you. And it's been particularly hostile in recent weeks. So we really are appreciative that you took a day out of your schedule to come down and spend time with us. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my honor. Thanks.
Really great. A little bit of bio on Nick. Nick is PBS News' Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent. He leads the NewsHour's daily foreign coverage, including multiple trips to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, again, with kids at home, and has created week-long series for the NewsHour from nearly a dozen countries. The NewsHour, and he pours water for me too. I mean, he does it all. The NewsHour series Inside
the floors if you need me to.
Russia won a 2017 Peabody Award and the National Press Club's Edwin Hood Award for Diplomatic Correspondence. In 2020, Nick received the American Academy of Diplomacy's Arthur Ross Media Award for distinguished reporting and analysis on foreign affairs. He was a member of the NewsHour team that was awarded the 2021 Peabody Award for coverage of COVID-19 and a 2023 DuPont Columbia Award for coverage of Afghanistan and Ukraine. He's covered more hotspots than one can count, including the war in Gaza, the wars in Central Asia, conflicts in Africa and beyond. I think last week you did something from Sudan, if I remember correctly, or about Sudan on top of it. And prior to the NewsHour, he worked at ABC News and Al Jazeera. So we really are honored to have Nick with us. Nick and I ran into each other at a lounge area at a Bruce Springsteen concert last September, and we were just in the early stages of trying to think about who we wanted, and Nick had always been on our mind, and so I just popped the question without checking with anybody, and I'm delighted that Nick said yes on the spot. And we can talk about Bruce Springsteen if we want to get there.
How can you say no at a Bruce Springsteen concert?
Exactly. So you heard David Brooks talk about the moral ecology. I had just read that book and that passage, and David wrote it before Jim's passing, but we were about to do the first NewsHour partnership with the NewsHour for Judy, and it has sort of been a theme of these conversations. Part of what David was getting at is the NewsHour itself, how Jim established a tone and a way of looking at the world. But Nick, as I thought about your coming here, it's both how you report and what you report, but you report on a world that for 80 years the United States has defined both in terms of our interests and our values. And over the last set of years, there's been the moral fabric in America that has has managed world order has gone from fraying to fracturing to maybe shattering. And I'd like to take us around the world in that regard, but start here at home. We talked a little bit in advance of this. In addition to covering these places around the world, you cover the big institutions of government, the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence agencies, and the broader political consensus that they operate in that appears to be no more. So tell us a little bit about how you keep the moral ecology of the NewsHour in a world where not just the world order, but the moral order appears to be shattering.
So thank you for having me here, and thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming today and online as well. And I guess I'll start by answering that with a version of what David said last year. In the book, David talks about his appearances with Jim and seeing Jim's face either go to a frown when David would say something crass, that's the word David used, or a little bit of a sparkle in his eye when David would say something thoughtful. And for those of you who were here last year, and you saw part of what David Brooks said about the NewsHour, he defined it a little bit in the negative last year. He said that Jim and the show aimed to be not crass, not unfair, and then the end of that was not forgettable. And so I think my version is in the positive sense, so not crass, thoughtful, right? What we try and do is, despite what a lot of television or what a lot of media does because it's entertaining, is the sound bites and the fights. Our fights are more drawn out and thoughtful and more sober and serious. And we try to get rid of some of the distractible items and get actually at policy and have proper debates and hear from both sides. And that's the second part, not unfair, so we try to be fair. But David's last point was that Jim would always say, let's not do something that people will forget by tomorrow. And so the positive version of that is memorable. And I think that is, when it comes to my personal moral ecology, to borrow David's phrase, but to borrow the idea of what Jim wanted the NewsHour to be and what media, in my opinion, should be, is that when I go to Ukraine or Gaza or Pakistan, I have learned that the opposite of war is not peace, it is humanity. It is teaching or reminding someone on the opposite side of the planet, in this case, on her sofa in Virginia or Ohio or Oregon, that perhaps a woman in Gaza loves their children just as the woman back in America does, or the man in Afghanistan has the same hopes and dreams for his children as the parent back home. And so if I can teach somebody that the person on the other side of an ocean or a wall or a border has the same humanity, that is my moral ecology. And I think that, to borrow a story that I tell often from Ukraine, I was at a cemetery not long after the full-scale invasion when we went with Ukrainian police, basically CSI equivalent, into a place that had a series of freshly dug graves because the people in there had been Ukrainians who had been tortured by Russian occupiers and hastily buried. And I filmed with a woman in that cemetery who had to watch the unwatchable. She had to watch her son's body be exhumed. And it occurred to me in that moment that the second worst moment of her life, the first being, of course, when he died, that the Russians had stolen this man's dignity twice, both when they tortured and killed him, and then in this moment when his body was exhumed by Ukrainian police to investigate war crimes. And I went up to her and I thought, how could I possibly ask you anything? It's exploitative, it's rude, it's, who am I and what are we doing here to do this? And yet, what I believe is how to be memorable, what it is that empathy requires, is that I have to believe that in my asking her a question, I am not exploiting her, but I am instead providing the humanity that the Russians have twice stole. And so I asked the simple question, tell me about your son. And she got to share her son. And he had a name, and his name was Maxim. And she got to share his story. And so that is the humanity that we hope to bring.
It's really great, Nick. Thanks to our friends at the NewsHour, we have a short reel of some greatest hits of Nick's. It's not quite the 3.5-hour Bruce Springsteen concert. It's only 3 hours. No, it's about 4 or 5 minutes. If we could please play the reel.
Welcome to the Friendship Bridge, even though things here aren't very friendly at the moment. Behind me is an Estonian castle from the Middle Ages. Nigeria may be Africa's richest country, but here in Lagos alone, there are more than 100 slums, including this one. This is known as Makoko, where the houses are literally built on stilts on the water. Castro's 1959 revolution promised a better future. Here, as in many small towns across Cuba, the economic promises of the revolution haven't been fulfilled. The Great Wall was built over centuries by multiple dynasties, and Chinese leaders who took a defensive stance used it for protection. Today, China looks out over the wall and projects its power with an ambitious and expansive foreign policy. This is the spot where Boris Nemtsov was killed, and you can see the corner of the Kremlin right there, just a few hundred yards away, and you can see the memorial for him that's on this bridge. What was this city like before the war?
This is also a hospital building, and civilians were living in the basement. The missile hit here.
This is right at the epicenter of the counteroffensive, where Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back a little. They're trying to expand their territory. The Russian lines just half a mile both that way, and you could hear all the firing. Can Europe actually make plans for Ukraine? Can you and the United States work on a strategy for Ukraine when you're getting these mixed messages?
For us, it's very clear. It is to put the pressure on Russia to really stop this war.
This is the impact site for one of those Iranian ballistic missiles, and if you see the size of this crater, that's about 30 feet deep and maybe 50 feet wide. The first Trump administration approved an $8 billion sale of F-16s to Taiwan. Once they actually arrive, Taiwan would have 200 F-16s, the largest number of F-16s in Asia. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Nick, let's start at home. You spend a lot of time talking to folks, maybe walking the halls of the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department. Do they see the world the same way that we did for 80 years? How do you think they define America's role in the world, including the sort of moral infrastructure behind it?
People ask me what's changed since January 20th, and I tell them I use Signal a lot. The benefit of that joke is it's actually true. I think, regardless of the electronic means of communication right now favored by some senior officials, or in the past favored by some senior officials before Signalgate, is that no, I think there are members of the administration, and the president included, although I think he has a couple of various strands of a worldview. But no, there is a desire among many of the senior aides to the president and the president himself to see the world as it was. And what does that mean? It means that they believe in a, call it a more realist sense, in which countries can and will and should achieve what they can. Individual countries are effectively the means through which we communicate, whether that's economic, military, diplomatic, and the United States benefits from a world in which those individual countries have individual relationships with Washington, and Washington pushes as far and achieves as much as it can, and other countries either suffer what they must or make a deal in order to get what they can. And again, this is kind of providing a political science frame on what is a very messy day-to-day, but I do believe that that's a fundamentally different view than many of the president's predecessors who've hoped to maintain a world created by 1945, whether Bretton Woods, whether Yalta, whether the European Union created in order to avoid another land war on the continent. They see those institutions, especially when it comes to Europe, as a threat. They do not see as much benefit from the Bretton Woods institutions. They do not see as much benefit from a globalist ideological viewpoint that we have at its core, what NATO is, what the EU is, what some of the other international organizations are. They see instead a powerful country in the United States, and they see other powers, whether that's Beijing, Moscow, or others, achieving what they can as well. And so whether that's about Ukraine, whether that's about Panama and Colombia and Greenland, or even whether that's about South Africa and how the president has been treating that country, I think there is a desire to see the world slightly differently than most of his predecessors. And again, it's kind of a highfalutin, political science version of what's happening. But I do think fundamentally that is how they see it. I think regionally, we'll talk about this more, it's seen a little bit differently. East Asia is seen a lot differently than Europe, for example. But fundamentally, that is how many of them see the world, and it is a bit of a revolution.
These institutions of government are populated by people. How are the institutions faring and holding up? Are they still, or do the people simply salute smartly and do what the commander-in-chief says, or the heads of those cabinet agencies, or do they feel that the laws that established those institutions and the laws that are still on the books in many ways about everything from the rules of war, use of nuclear weapons, on the economic side, the trade laws that are on the books, what if they don't comport with the commands of the commander-in-chief?
So all I can do is talk about the institutions that I cover, which are the national security institutions. So National Security Council, State Department, Defense Department, Intelligence Community, and the White House, but really the part of the White House that does foreign policy and national security. So I think that there are members of the inner circle of the president, and this will be no surprise to this audience, who see the entrenched bureaucracy, as they would call it, as the enemy. They see whether through, you might call them kind of traditional appointees that the first Trump administration had, especially at its beginning, those people resisting the president's agenda and having staff who facilitated that resistance. I think the second Trump administration thought that they had cured that. They thought they had a better personnel approach so that they have cabinet secretaries who are much more aligned personally and professionally with the president, but they still believe, and you see this whether it's through Doge or Elon Musk, or whether some of the comments I get from Department of Defense officials who I talk to, is that there is a distrust of even some uniformed members of the military, of the Joint Staff. There's a distrust of career civil servants at the State Department. There's a distrust of National Security Council officials, who, again, these people would describe themselves as patriots, as bipartisan, as leaning into whatever the commander-in-chief, whatever the policies that the commander-in-chief want to pursue within the structure of law. I think there is today a distrust for a lot of those people, and you see that playing out, obviously, whether it's through what Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is going through, or just simply the personnel decisions at the beginning of January 20th and how many people were pushed out. As for the institutions themselves, though, they are, from my perspective, they're holding in the sense that, you mentioned nuclear weapons. There is a very specific code, essentially, that the United States follows, that the U.S. government, the U.S. military follows when it comes to that. There are dozens and hundreds of people working on Ukraine in the State Department at the NSC, in the IC. Those people continue their work. And so, from my perspective, there is still normal routine business being conducted, perhaps slightly differently in terms of the style, perhaps slightly differently in terms of some of the personnel, but nonetheless, the NSC is trying to do strategy, right? DOD is trying to do the military, state is trying to do diplomacy, and USAID and the version that they see it should be. So, I think, again, a lot of people come to me and say, well, isn't the sky falling? That's not really for me to say. That's a historical perspective in the future. But I do know that the acts of day-to-day policy continue, even if the style is slightly different.
Let's take a little tour around the world. We'll start with Russia and Ukraine. You've been covering it for a long time. In 2014, you were there when the Maidan uprising occurred, when Russia took Crimea. Is it the same? I mean, obviously, the big parts of Ukraine are now occupied by Russia, but is Ukraine as a nation the same as it was back then? And how does that, any changes there affect the moral landscape of the conflict?
Well, the word you used, I think, is the key: nation, right? So President Zelensky gave a speech on New Year's Eve. It's a kind of New Year's speech. It's a tradition. Putin does it. Zelensky does it. It's a Russian tradition, Ukrainian, Soviet tradition. And he described that on February 22nd, 2022, the day of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine became something new. We, as in his words, we realized who we really were. And I did a story on the year anniversary of the Ukrainian Revolution that put his words right next to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, right? So that we created a new nation, right? That is what Lincoln saw in the sacrifice in the fields of Gettysburg. And that is essentially what Ukrainians see today. In that, in 2014, when I was there, or for years before, it is not a cliche to describe Ukraine as a slightly divided nation, whether by language, Ukrainian and Russian, whether by culture and history, looking toward Moscow, celebrating a Soviet past, or looking toward the West and the EU and NATO. And the divides that I saw in 2014 in Kharkiv and Mariupol and Odessa, where I would cover some of the uprisings that had been fomented by Russian secret services, by pro-Russian elements that had been planted in Ukraine, where I would go to one side of the city and see the pro-Russian separatists on the other side of the city, or the other side of the square, and see people flying the Ukrainian and the EU flags. Those divides are over. There is no pro-Russian party in Ukraine anymore. There is no pride in Soviet history connected to Vladimir Putin and today's Russia. It's simply gone. You do not create the level of trauma and pain that the Kremlin and the Russian Federation's military has created in Ukraine without, in turn, creating a similar amount of unity and anger on the other side. And so the best story that I have for this, an old friend who's a policymaker once accused me of being a peddler of anecdotes. And I think she didn't mean that in a good way. But, we're journalists, right? We say we're slaves to our stories, slaves to our sources. Fine, let's peddle an anecdote here. A family, two young parents with a young daughter, probably 3 or 4 years old, walks out of Irpin, walks out of Bucha in the first month of the war. The cauldron of cruelty that has been the Ukraine war, as we all know now, of Bucha and Irpin. And they walk out and they try and do an interview in Ukrainian. They had never spoken Ukrainian. They were Russian speakers from the time they were born, their kids were born. And my translator says, with all due respect, he doesn't speak either one. Looking at me. You can speak Russian. It's okay. And she says, no. I will not speak the language of my oppressor, and my daughter will not speak the language of my oppressor. So this is as fundamental as inside our kitchen, we will not speak that language anymore, and we're going to learn Ukrainian. And so that is just one version of what has happened. Zelensky's politically not as popular anymore. We can talk about that. It's not quite as unified as it was, but it is absolutely against Putin and against Russia. And the old saying that I and a few other journalists have used is Putin understood the illness, right, that Ukraine was drifting west, but his medicine, his remedy, has created the opposite impact.
Does that change the stakes for the United States?
Well, so President Obama very famously to Jeffrey Goldberg said, Jeff, the United States will never, ever, ever care about Ukraine as much as Russia will. And I think Trump would agree with that. I think in President Biden, Kyiv had someone who didn't see it that way, who, while Ukraine may not be as important to Washington as Russia, Obama, Biden, and Trump, none of them want to go to war over Ukraine, and all three have been united on that. But President Biden saw a bigger principle, and they struggled a little bit in their communications for a while. The rules-based orders, effectively what they kept on using, didn't really poll well, but they believed, and Lloyd Austin talked about this a lot, Tony Blinken talked about this a lot, Jake Sullivan talked about this a lot, is the principle that we cannot let stand, the principle of 80 years after the war, a bigger military invading a smaller neighbor. And whether you just simply talk about the principle, or you talk about Taiwan and Beijing and not giving Beijing the good idea that they can survive if they invaded Taiwan, I think the Biden administration tried to apply that. But they did so with restraint, right? I mean, their critics would say they didn't give Ukraine enough support, therefore we ended up in the stalemate. They were too scared of Putin's nuclear saber, and so they held back some support. So that's, for another day. But the bottom line is that a united Ukraine to Europe meant more than a divided Ukraine, in the sense that Europe now identifies much more with Kyiv, and even Kharkiv, which is, crazy in history, than it would have without the full-scale invasion. NATO is bigger than it would have been without the full-scale invasion. And even post-2014, when Russia annexed and invaded Crimea, you got a shift in NATO toward the 2% that we now say isn't even enough. So I do think that a united Ukraine, a Ukraine that has a more national identity, has really done quite a lot of shifting where it comes to Brussels thinking, and to a certain extent, Washington, at least under the Biden administration. But that's all principles. The reality on the ground, Trump administration argues, and frankly, even some within the Biden administration argues, Ukraine is not going to re-seize all of its occupied territory by itself, militarily. And Russia does have 1,550 nuclear warheads capable of launch right now. That's the reality. That goes back to the realist portion of this. And so that's why President Trump and his allies believe that it is in U.S. interests to end the war, to reset with Russia, and to move on, rather than take the war and take Ukraine in the principle of what the Russian invasion stands for.
The U.S. approach to ending the war has, under President Trump, has not just been unsettling to Vladimir Zelensky, it's been unsettling to Europe. Is it unsettling for what it says morally, that we're not standing up for a country defending its own independence, or because suddenly they're now worried that the U.S. won't stand up for them?
Yeah, I think again, the moral connection between Brussels and Kyiv is a relatively new one. The European fear of Washington's isolationism is not a new fear, right? And so we've gone through versions of this before. In the last 25 years, the most obvious example is the Iraq War. in which, you go to the cafeteria and Rayburn on the Hill and it's freedom fries rather than French fries, right? And so, there's versions of that. And obviously, during the Cold War, there were times where Europe was not entirely happy with what Washington felt like it needed to do. But I think, unlike East Asia, which we'll get to, unlike the Middle East, that are seeing opportunities right now with the Trump administration, there is, the scientific term is an existential freakout by most European officials I speak to. And these are people who were very critical, by the way, and I think this story has gotten lost, of the Biden administration for Afghanistan. These are people who came out of the first Trump administration, who worked with Trump at the end, with him on NATO in terms of getting spending higher, and came in to hear President Biden saying, we're back, and he and Macron had this debate in the first G7, well, for how long? And Biden's like, we're back, Blinken says, we're back, and then, okay, we're gonna consult on Afghanistan, sorry, we're just gonna leave, even though every European official said don't. So these are European officials who felt burned at the beginning of Biden, not just by Trump, and they had three things happened to them. One was Pete Hegseth went over to Brussels, and his speeches were edited to the last minute, and there was different versions of them, but the bottom line they heard was, we are giving away Ukraine's opportunity to get its territory back militarily, and we are giving away Ukraine's ability to join NATO. And then J.D. Vance goes to the Munich Security Forum, and I was there, and I mean, to say that that was like a bomb, a rhetorical bomb in that room is an understatement. There wasn't a whisper in that room when he gave a speech about European democracy and the European freedom of speech. And I mean, people were shocked, angry, offended all at once, and they're still kind of grappling with it. And then President Trump calls Putin without calling Europe first and says, we're launching peace talks. And it felt existential to Europe. And some of them took a breath and said, wow, how could it be existential? That was just 6 days. It was literally 6 days where Europe says whiplash. But they felt it was a crescendo, right? Meaning, first Trump administration, obviously the rhetoric about Europe, concerns about Biden being short-termed, essentially, and Afghanistan was part of that. They rallied around Ukraine, and so there was a sense of unity. And then for that unity to be broken so quickly, and then Signalgate exposed the fact that what Hegseth says, what Vance says, this is not a negotiating position for tariffs. This is a genuine, as to quote the Secretary of Defense, disdain for European sensibility, right, for that very idea of the EU that we talked about, right? The president sees it as a trade union, an anti-American trade union. Every European would say, we just don't want to go to war again. That's why we created the EU, and the euro is just part of that. But it's really the EU, right, with the Commission at its executive core. So Europe sees this as existential. They've gotten over that shock. They're taking steps. They're trying to work with the Trump administration despite the tariffs. What does that look like? NATO will pledge higher than 2% at the Hague summit in June. There is an attempt by especially Britain, France, Germany to lead an effort, a coalition of the willing, an interesting phrase that Keir Starmer used from the past, just borrowing it from W. Bush, trying to create some kind of what is known in the vernacular as a security guarantee, essentially long-term security support for Ukraine in terms of weapons and troops. Europe's trying to do that. They're trying to step up. Frankly, that's what the United States wants them to do. That's the strategy. Obviously, we focus on the rhetoric, but if we take out the rhetoric and see the strategy of the United States right now in Ukraine, it is to try to end the war and try to get Europe to stand up and accelerate. They're trying to do that, but they've got a long way to go. They're a generation behind plus, and they know it.
All right, we've done the easy one. Let's do the Middle East. You've been diving in and out of this conflict for many, many years, but particularly since October 6th, almost 2 years ago now, have been several times. It is extraordinarily painful to watch from here. I can only imagine what it's like on the ground. What is your map of that conflict? How do you wrap your head around it and report on it, whether it's on the ground in Gaza, on the ground in Israel, the other countries that have come into the conflict and might be pulled into future part? Already there's been conflict between Israel and Iran, but it could open up into a full-blown regional war, not just skirmishes.
I'll peddle another anecdote here. I was in Gaza in 2014, which at the time we believed was the largest war that Israel was willing to fight in Gaza. It lasted about 7 or 8 weeks and was very, very deadly and very destructive. And there was a moment when I was live on TV and the bombs and the missiles got so loud that I knew viewers couldn't hear me. And so I said to the anchor, I'm just going to stop for a second because I know you can't hear me, and I'll start again. And so it wasn't that long, 15 seconds, I don't even know, 12 seconds, which of course in TV it's an eternity. And I'm just staring at the screen, and the anchor's face goes white, but I'm just looking, and I start again when the bombs start. And the anchor said, we're sorry for Nick, and his crew for keeping him out there. Nick, go find somewhere safe, as if there's a safe place in a war zone. But I got a text afterward from my mother, who unfortunately was watching. And the text said, you can't go before I do. Gaza, Pakistan, Iraq, Ukraine, Kenya, Somalia, these are like merit badges on the war reporter's sash, but they're also each scars. For me, and I admit I was naive when I started this journey that there would be no impact on me or my family. And I say that anecdote because the answer to your question is that I have to believe, and I am so grateful that my wife and my parents and my family believe that it is worth telling the stories of those people whose stories need to be told. It is worth trying to bring the humanity that has been stolen. And, it's harder to put on a flak jacket now than it used to be. But I still believe that whether it's Gaza, Israel, or Iran, and I'll do the politics in a second, I still believe that bringing that humanity and bringing that empathy is worthwhile. And so that's all I can do.
I want to come back to the United States' role in it in a second, but I want to ask about the sort of principal combatants, as it were, in the core conflict right now, Israel and Gaza. There's always a theory of war, that wars end when both sides have had enough. But one thing that we keep seeing in this conflict is a next generation rising up who've witnessed war, and rather than walking away from it, seem more committed to it. You talked about being in Gaza in 2014. We're now 11 years later. 11 years from now, are we going to still be fighting this war?
Maybe. Yeah. I think it's not so much that both sides have had enough, it's that both sides are finally convinced they cannot win. And I don't see evidence of that on either side, frankly, right now. So let's do the politics. So, Israel, Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure from what is the most right-wing government in Israeli history, especially 2 right-wing ministers who hold, I think now about 6 or 7 seats in the Knesset. Bibi's coalition is, I think, up to 67 or 68, maybe even 69. You need 61 in the Knesset to have the majority. So he has ruled in the last few years with a lot less than that. I think at one point he had 61 exactly, 62. And recall, before October the 7th, there were 4 elections in Israel. So Israel is a deeply divided country in a way that's different than here. It's not so much a bipartisan, it's splintered, the politics, because there are so many parties. So you have pressure on the right for him to continue the war. And this goes to that idea of, are they convinced that they can't win? No, it's the opposite. That the right-wing members of his coalition believe that they can win on the battlefield. And the previous defense minister got in the cabinet meetings and said, you guys are crazy. There's no way we can win against Hamas on the battlefield. And ultimately he was fired for that position, and they have a defense minister who says they can win on the battlefield. So is the Israeli establishment, use that word specifically, the Israeli political establishment has pressure on it and believes, or at least enough of them believe, they can win on the battlefield, so they will continue. The Israeli intelligence services, as we all have long known, have a very difficult relationship personally with Bibi. He just fired the Shin Bet director. But the Mossad directors go way back with Bibi and have has had lots of disagreements, real fundamental disagreements on how to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, and in this case, how to keep Hamas down. So that's on the Israeli side. Hamas is heavily degraded, heavily degraded, much less capable of launching attacks on Israel, let alone launching any kind of October 7th style attack. I mean, almost 2 years, about a year ago, the intelligence community under the Biden administration assessed that Hamas could not launch another October 7th. As far as I know, that assessment continues under the Trump administration. So Hamas isn't capable of that, but it is interwoven into the fabric of Gaza. And what do I mean by that? You know, I spent a lot of time in Gaza. Every family has somebody who works for the UN, right? So if they're a teacher or a janitor at a school, they're employed by the UN, or the government, which is Hamas, run by the government, or a connection between the two. So UNRWA and Hamas are the giant institutions in Gaza. And there's simply no way to change that, right? One day, will Hamas demilitarize? I don't know. That's certainly what a lot of people want. Will one day Hamas accede to the Palestinian Authority or share with the Palestinian Authority? Who knows? But the plan for Israel is not that. There is no plan to replace Hamas with the PA. There is no plan to replace UNRWA and replace the governance of Hamas. There is simply, right now, a stated desire to destroy Hamas. And again, according to the intelligence services in Israel, and according to the former defense minister, that's impossible. That's impossible. So that war in Gaza will continue until something changes on the ground, or there's some kind of political settlement. And that's kind of the reality. In the meantime, you know, we've covered this, the humanitarian aspects of Gaza are horrific. Other than Sudan, it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, and Gaza is a postage stamp compared to Sudan. You have 90% of the buildings that have been destroyed. There's not a single person who's not been displaced multiple times. And so, you know, there hasn't been any aid allowed in for the last month. So you have a level of deprivation being experienced among Gazans that's really unprecedented. And Israelis, you know, there is, you know, it's a cliche to say October 7th was their 9/11, but it really is a pivot in history for Israel. There was a day before October the 7th and there's a day after October the 7th. They have not had the political reckoning, but they've certainly had a kind of spiritual reckoning or an identity reckoning that the Israeli government wasn't capable of defending them, that the Israeli military couldn't come to their aids for hours, days sometimes in some kibbutz. That's a really fundamental shock to the Israeli society. And they're still grappling with that. And we see that even in Passover just the last few days.
One quick question there. You know, it is said of Russia that Putin will keep fighting this war because the end of the war is potentially dangerous to him. Is that the same case for Bibi? If the war ends, is Bibi Netanyahu's grip on power weakened?
Yeah, I think the assumption is that if the war ends in a way that is not seen as a victory by his own coalition, yeah, that the coalition itself would very likely be imperiled, and therefore his prime ministership would be imperiled. And I think his critics would argue that it goes one step further, is that he personally would be imperiled, and that's one of his motivations. Most Israeli analysts I speak to say that is not, this is not a war about Bibi's personal survival. This is a war about the coalition's survival to a certain extent. So that's a little different. But it's different, right? It's in a democracy, the coalition would fall, the prime minister would fall. In the Kremlin, this is about Putin, and then we can extend the comparison to Xi Jinping and Taiwan, is that if Vladimir Putin's war is seen as a loss, a net loss for the Kremlin, by the way, there's no indication of that right now. In fact, you could argue that if the old Biden policy had continued, Russia would just slowly keep eroding the front lines, but would have a kind of an economic problem within a generation. Now you see, apparently, a Trump administration trying to figure out what's in the middle. That's a big policy shift, obviously. But for Putin, if the Ukraine war is seen as a net loss, yeah, his standing would be imperiled because the very structures of power that have kept him there, which he himself has personally pitted against each other. The way the Russian system works is that there's not really a National Security Council, it's that there are aides at the top of various ministries, and they fight with each other for the patronage of the king, of the czar. That's essentially what a system he's created. And so they fight, they're divided, they're weak, he's strong. If they believe that he's weak, then he's vulnerable to an oligarch or somebody else coming in, and that's what we saw a little bit of, a couple of years ago. But yeah, and Xi Jinping, the assumption is that Xi Jinping would lose his grip on power if he launched a failed invasion of Taiwan.
Let's go there, and then after that, we're going to have some students' questions, and then if there's time left, we'll take questions from the audience. Xi Jinping and China. We've gone from 2 hot wars to a very cold war, but one that could get hot. You mentioned Taiwan. That's not the only place it could get hot, but it's probably the one that people watch most closely. We are in a trade war right now. Does a trade war become a hot war? Is the trade war masking the Trump administration taking its eye off the ball of potential security conflict? How are you seeing that conflict, particularly in a fractured domestic consensus? That seems to be one thing that American distrust, if not hostility, toward China seems to be constant across both parties.
Yeah, the only bipartisan thing, other than having a dog in Washington these days, is confronting Beijing, basically. And so this is pretty much the one area where you do have unanimity on the national security side, certainly not on trade. So a couple points. One, the national security momentum that was created by Trump's National Security Council staff during the first administration, led by Matt Pottinger, and his team, continues. And so that was a little bit of tariffs, slightly coordinated with them, only slightly. But really what Matt and team did was reorient the entire national security apparatus. This started with Obama's pivot to Asia, but it really became a technological Cold War under the first Trump administration. And that is the fundamental aspect of it. And it's not about technology only. So it's about 5G, it's about telecommunications, it's about relationships with countries that have been hedging, all the way from Panama, whose MOU with the United States last week talked about 5G, to the Philippines, whose 5G was Huawei, still is, I think, but the US was trying to change that. The Biden administration continued that effort. So the national security confrontation of China continues on a fundamental technological and infrastructural level, not to mention the military buildup. People's Liberation Army buildup in the last decade or so has been the fastest in world history, fastest modernization in world history, I should say. And the U.S. Navy leading, but with the Air Force as well, the DoD as a whole is trying to modernize in the Pacific in such a fundamental way, in such an expensive way, in order to prevent a Taiwan invasion and confront Beijing, or at least deter Beijing. And so that continues. The trade war, you know, it's in the news every day, right? There's not unanimity within the Trump cabinet on China, just like there wasn't during the first Trump administration, which pitted the national security people against the people who have been dealing with business in China and making a lot of money for many years. And I shouldn't say just making a lot of money. For 40 years, we believed that economic integration could prevent war and would lift all boats. And it has. But obviously, in the United States, certain pockets felt like globalization left them behind. So that's where we are. So the trade war, I think, from what the president said yesterday, will calm down a little bit so that there can be some kind of grand bargain with Xi Jinping. Is that about Taiwan? Is that about technology? Is that about relationships with countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore? I think everything will be on the table. I think the National Security Council, their priority will be continuing to confront Chinese technology and to continuing to modernize U.S. military to deter China. But there's this business aspect, is can you get manufacturing to leave China? Can you get manufacturing back in the United States? And if whether it's onshoring into the United States, whether it's friendshoring, right, partner shoring, if you will, into Vietnam, places like that the U.S. has been really trying to do, that's a huge generational challenge. And I think that trade war is in the middle of the larger context of how the U.S. is trying to confront China.
Nick, one big thing about the Trump approach to the world is moving away from multilateral organizations and toward direct one-on-one talks. Yeah. You know, 90 trade deals in 90 days, yeah, plus 2 live wars with a special envoy flying back and forth between Moscow and Kyiv and Jerusalem and Gaza. And, what is your sense of how the system is working or not working on trying to do all these deals at one time?
Again, I come back to what I said before. There is still a system. It is still working. Steve Witkoff has staff who have been working for the State Department and the National Security Council for a long time. The NSC Middle East person has been in and out of the executive branch and the legislative branch and think tanks in DC for 20 years, right? You said it yourself. These institutions are still staffed by people, and they are people who have been involved in traditional and unorthodox foreign policy for years and decades. So that will continue. The fact that Witkoff is leading this is different, of course, because he's not an expert in this stuff, right? But what he has is the card that, frankly, anybody on the other side always wants, in that he has Oval Office privileges, he has the president's cell phone, and they talk all the time. So if you're Vladimir Putin, you're not talking to Wendy Sherman or Rose Gottermiller, who know the Russian playbook, who are going to push back in the Russian playbook, right? But you're talking to somebody who there's nobody closer to the president than Steve Witkoff. And Trump gave that away one day when he said, we're about to launch talks with Iran. It's almost at the very highest level. That's what he said. It's nearly at the highest level. He wasn't talking about the Secretary of State. He wasn't talking about the Secretary of Defense. He was talking about Steve Witkoff. So what Steve has, and a lot of people like him, by the way, that's another story, but what Steve has is the connection to the president. So whether you're Putin, whether you're the Iranian foreign minister, whether you're Hamas, right, fine. It may not be traditional, but again, you know that what you tell Steve Witkoff is going straight to the president, and that's the dynamic that's played out.
Really terrific. His answer, but maybe also the situation. Speaking of really terrific, this is something that we started thanks to Judy. This was Judy's request in the first Lehrer lecture was to have student involvement in the event, and it was a terrific idea, and we have really terrific students. So I'm going to start with the 3 Miller Center interns, 3 different parts of the center. My intern goes first. So Laura Howard is a 4th-year undergrad, double majoring in political and social thought and foreign affairs. She has been my intern for a year working on a big project we've been doing here on presidential powers. After graduating this year, she's going to go work at the law firm of Steptoe as a pre-law fellow. Steptoe is a law firm that was founded by UVA law grads, and so it's great that they're keeping up a tradition by getting one of our best. So, Laura.
Thank you, and thank you for such a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed listening to it. So there's just been substantial conversation over the past week or so about the State Department and the current administration's proposed changes to it, whether it was the draft executive order or Secretary Rubio's statements more recently. And I'm just curious how you think these conversations and any changes that might come as a result will impact the U.S.'s standing on the geopolitical stage, and what message this sends to historic allies and rivals.
If I were to give you the exact movement of the bureaus inside the State Department, this audience would fall asleep. And I say that because in part, at least if you talk to the senior State Department officials who are doing it, they say that the democracy and rights and labor departments moving from an undersecretary level into the director of foreign affairs, literally I told you it was going to get boring, or the democracy, right, democracy, rights and labor, and then the population refugees department moving over. They say that, look, we're not giving up on these things. The department will simply be organized more regionally. So if you have a program in Latin America, you report up to the Western Hemisphere Affairs. If you program in Europe, that's EUR, the European Eurasian Bureau. So, and you know, there is precedent for this before we assume this is totally radical and has never been done. The British government and the Australian government all folded their development arms into their foreign ministries in the last 20 years. And there were many in the last 20 years in the US who were calling for the same thing. So that's the argument from them. What you hear from Democrats on the Hill, and then I'll expand this to the USAID argument, and what you hear from humanitarians on the ground, and what you hear from places like the Pacific Islands or those countries in Southeast Asia, is that, look guys, while Elon, you know, you may say that you have a plan, but everybody heard Elon Musk say that this is about taking USAID to the wood chipper. And everybody on the planet saw that photo of him with the chainsaw. So fine, you may have a neat and tidy organization, but the vibe is that you don't care about a lot of these things. And you zoom in, especially on AID and especially on foreign assistance, and you realize that especially when it comes to China, right, the organizations that went into the Pacific Islands, that went into Cambodia, that go to Taiwan, that go to Vietnam and provide security assistance, that provide policing assistance, that even provide assistance when it comes to businesses that is designed to facilitate US rather than Chinese investment, guess what? That was all foreign assistance, and a lot of it got cut. And then when it got cut, everybody looked around and was like, what got cut? What do you mean? Foreign military financing to Taiwan got cut. It was like, well, you guys cut the budget of foreign assistance. Sorry, I hate to break it to you, but foreign assistance includes this. Say, oh, okay, we'll fix that. So the principle was break first, fix later. And that's what they've done. It has had an enormous humanitarian impact on the ground for small organizations, PEPFAR included in Africa, the single most important legacy of George W. Bush when it comes to humanitarian affairs, almost to the point where people would die. I mean, UNAID says people were about to die here. And then they pulled it back, and some organizations are fine. So it's really messy. Some organizations have gotten their money, some haven't. So again, the vibe has been, how can you do this? How can you let, whether it's a security relationship with the Pacific Islands or the Southeast Asia, or whether it's just kids dying from AIDS, preventable HIV transmission, right? That has a lasting impact for sure. But the state reorganization by itself, it gets kind of arcane. Yeah.
Great. Next is Meg Anamaneni, a fourth-year undergrad, double majoring in economics and foreign affairs, and minoring in public policy and leadership. And Meg has been an intern in our project on democracy and capitalism, which many of our regular attendees know about. Meg, please.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. So my question is, I know with Trump's current stance on limiting military aid to Ukraine and advocating for a U.S. pullback from the Russia-Ukraine war, you've talked a little bit about how this shifts the burden of support onto the European Union. I'm curious how internal division within EU member states affects this support and how those internal divisions might change the leverage for Putin on ceasefire or peace talk negotiations.
It's really important because the dynamic that's playing out is if you're a what did Hegseth call unelected bureaucrat, right? If you're an unelected bureaucrat in Brussels working on trade, and you're Belgian or French or German or British, not British, sorry, not anymore.
Not anymore.
My wife's British. She'll laugh at that. You're not feeling great about the transatlantic partnership, right? And that plays out, politically, whether you go all the way up to Macron, the incoming chancellor of Germany, who will be there this weekend, Merz, has said things that are kind of extraordinary, even though he is a little bit of a ideological. He's conservative, so he would be a natural ally of a Republican administration. The things that he said about a divide between the United States and Europe are really unprecedented, and we'll see what he actually does when he's in office. But the division inside the EU is when you go east. So again, if you're German or French, you're thinking, this is not normal, this is not kosher, we don't like this, how can we push back? If you're Poland or Estonia, or Latvia or Lithuania, you may kind of grumble, but at the end of the day, you need the United States. At the end of the day, even 4 or 5% of GDP of Polish defense spending is not going to replace the irreplaceable intelligence apparatus that the United States provides that goes into every single American weapon, by the way, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So the F-35s cannot work without U.S. intelligence. You may be Finland, and you have F-35s, but you need the pipeline to work. You need NATO to work. You need, from the NSA to CIA to DOD, you need it all to work, and you need to be allies. And that's why it's so critical for Brussels. They've been trying to take those centrifugal forces and keep them in. And that's why the trade stuff is really difficult, because the trade stuff does have the capacity to push Western and Eastern Europe apart. For that reason, Eastern Europe says, it doesn't matter. This stuff is more important. Western Europe says, no, we're not helping them if they're attacking, we're not helping the United States, they're attacking us on trade. And as an aside, this weapons, the story about weapons is a huge deal, because when the United States, 6 days it lasted, the United States turned off intelligence support for Ukraine, Finland and Estonia and France and Germany realized, could they do that for us too? And then they started looking at the F-35 and said, whoa. And then Trump trotted out the F-47, I wonder why it's called that, and he said, we're going to sell our allies a lower version because they may not be our allies in the future. That was a shock to the system. And you are seeing, again, Europe doesn't have that many choices, but you are seeing an attempt to say, we're not sure we can trust American weapons anymore. And that's really different, and that is not what Hegseth and Rubio and Waltz wanted at all. And it's frankly not what the president really intended, but that's what he feels about Europe. So it's a really, just watch that space, because if you see Canada and Europe create consortiums on weapons and they stop buying American weapons, it'll take a generation or two, but it's a very big long-term story. Yeah.
That's great. Finally, Emmett O'Brien. Emmett's a third year here at the Miller Center. He's an editorial assistant in our oral history program. Point of personal pride, Emmett is in the politics honors program, which I was in as an undergrad, and is also minoring in French, which I could not have done. So Emmett, over to you.
Thank you, and once again, thanks so much for your incredible insights in this talk. I want to step back a little bit more and talk about your work as a journalist. I think it's pretty clear, obviously, that journalists' main job is to be on the ground covering events in an objective manner, but I think it's also pretty clear that your coverage shapes the events themselves. So just from your perspective as a journalist, how does your work shape the information environment in which states and leaders operate? And especially how has that changed in such a kind of fractured media ecosystem?
I mean, it's a good question, and the answer would have, 10 or 20 years ago, would have been very different, right? Barbara Walters could go to Cairo and, what the prime minister, what the president said to her could shape a generation of thinking in the Middle East. Peter Jennings could go to Moscow. I came from ABC, so my memory is, Peter and Barbara, but we could do it with Tom or Dan Rather, right? These are single names that we all know because we all grew up with them, and Jim among them. I just don't see it as much that way anymore. Putin talks to Tucker Carlson for 2 hours and gives Tucker a history lesson that even Tucker was like, where is this going? And, did we understand more? Does it really shape what's happening? Maybe, but, Putin said the same thing on stage in 2007, right? So, does the incredible work that my colleagues at DOD are doing, it's leading to resignations and that kind of thing. Yeah, it shapes history, sure, but those tensions were inside already. Again, my colleagues who cover DOD exclusively are doing great work, and they're just exposing it. So maybe this is a little bit, I don't know, post-colonial of me, if you will, but I almost don't see the media's impact as much as it would have been a few years ago. I'm not dismissing our influence, especially at a moment when the interest in what we are reporting is at an all-time high. I mean, people come up to me and say, oh, isn't it so hard to work on the Trump administration? And, the National Security Advisor tweeted at me and criticized an interview with the Houthi foreign minister that I did as, suckling America's enemies or whatever he said. And, it's not easy, fine. But at the same time, we all have thick skins. And there was like another story 10 minutes later and, nobody even noticed. So I actually am of the belief that the media in some ways has less influence on history than it used to, if we define media as mainstream media. The influence of the technology that is delivering messages, so whether that's Twitter or YouTube or whatever it may be tomorrow, the ability for Donald Trump to have a direct line into American households, that was the communications revolution of 2016. That was thanks to Twitter, right? He just didn't need us anymore. And so I think the media has been assuming its importance. Not that it's not important, but assuming a level of importance instead of taking a critical look at ourselves and thinking, how can we be better? How can we be better produced or more fair or more thoughtful? That's what we need to do. Because we need to provide a platform from which, whether it's American or an international viewer or listener or reader, can say, I understand that better than I did 10 seconds or 10 minutes ago. I can come to my own conclusion. I am better informed. That's what we all try and do. But the thought that it's actually in the middle of shifting history, I don't know. Maybe I'm just from a different generation, but I sometimes doubt that these days. It's not to say that what we do isn't important. I give a whole lecture about that. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but that's kind of where I think what things have landed these days.
Thank you.
Well, Nick, I think we've run out of time. We've run a little over time. But let's just say for all of us that are regular NewsHour watchers, and I know that this is a room full of them, and many, many more watching out there on our feed and on the NewsHour feed, our big thanks to you. You all of you at the NewsHour mean a lot to us, but for those of us that cover world affairs and follow world affairs, none more important than you. Your coverage has been brave, insightful, humane, and memorable. You know, we walk away with many of those moments. I remember that broadcast. I had not heard that story. You told me you were going to tell it. I didn't know what story you were telling. I remember that broadcast. I didn't know about your mom texting you. So, so thank you for that. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for coming to Charlottesville and being with us. Thank you.